Good afternoon and good morning or good evening, depending from where you are connected. Welcome to today's webinar, where we will talk about standards and career guidance. I am Manuela Prina. I'm a head of unit at the European Training Foundation, and I'm very happy to open the meeting. Before starting, let me remind a couple of technical information. The first one is to remind all of you that there is interpretation available in Arabic, in French, and Russian language. So you can click on the interpretation sign and choose your preferred language to follow the event. The second important note is that, as you have seen, the meeting is being recorded, and we will actually use this video on the Open Space, which is the platform where all networks of ETF are hosted. So if you don't want to appear in the video, please keep your camera off. So we are ready, I think, to start. Let me briefly introduce the meeting today, where we follow up on some of the important topics that have emerged, in particular in the last year Global Career Guidance Month, where we really literally traveled all over the world to hear impressive stories, but also to share experiences, issues at stake, and shared concern regarding the implementation of career guidance services to really serve citizens of all age and in their transitions from school to work, from job to job, but also in their life path. So today we focus and we spotlight one important topic, which is standards. Why are we talking about standards? As you know, this is something that for some people remind rules, and some people could be allergic to rules, but we know that also rules allow to actually ensure that wherever you go, you know how to make things happen. And so a rule to make something work is there, and normally we don't read the rules. No, we buy something and we don't read the rules or the instructions, but those standards actually allow for you to use at best something, but also ensure that anybody can actually get the same service in a different context. So standards are linked to many issues: legislation, coordination mechanism, how people involved in the service itself are trained, and their competences, their abilities, their tasks, how the service is organized. It's something that is also linked to how the service is informed itself, the intelligence of the labor market, the monitoring and evaluation, and of course, the quality and the quality assurance of all of this. It's something which is very complex because we know that in most of our partner countries, there is a lot of on-the-job learning and a lot of attention on the delivery and on making sure that something takes place. And we need to actually see how this can be better also articulated through the reflection on standards. And today we have really the great pleasure to have with us very important practitioners that come both from the European Union and Europe, but also from countries that are far away and have a very important I would say history, but also very important investment in making sure that those standards hit then the ground and make the difference in how the service is organized and delivered. So I'm happy and I would like to thank the Canadian Career Development Foundation who recently developed new standards, and today they will share their experience with us. Euroguidance from Serbia, the NIS Foundation, that is a network of innovation in career guidance and counseling in Europe. And I have to apologize on behalf of the International Association for Education and Vocational Guidance, as they could not join us today, but we will make sure that their input also reach out to you. Today we will really have amazing contribution, and you're welcome, of course, to use the chat to ask questions and to interact as much as possible with our speakers. Before starting the session, we have 2 questions from you, and you will find the link to those questions in the chat. Now you see a link going to Mentimeter. You can also access directly from your mobile phone or from your browser, going on the website and entering the code 13192375. We will actually see the results of those polls at the end of the event. And so I give you 1 minute to complete it. So the first question is, does your country plan to or is in the process of developing standards? I see that there is a quite majority of yes coming up. Yeah. And then once and this is a question for those who answered yes, where we ask you which country are you from, so that we map out a bit the different countries that are united under this objective of developing or reinforcing or reflecting on standards related to career guidance. So we will go back to the poll at the end of the event, but I think it was an interesting overview to bring us together already on really a shared objective. So without taking more of your time, and I thank you all for being here today, let me introduce the first session and speaker, Ms. Serena Hoppings, Executive Director at the Canadian Career Development Foundation and Head of the Board of the International Center for Career Development and Public Policy. Serena, thank you for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. I'm delighted to have this chance to talk about our experience in Canada and to learn about your experiences as well. I think that yes, thank you. The PowerPoint is up so effectively. Thank you. So I will say that in my career, I don't think ever before has there been a time when there's been such strong recognition internationally of the importance of career guidance. You know, I have been in this field for a very long time, and for so long it was difficult to get people to even know that our field existed, let alone that it had something very, very important to contribute. And that is changing very much recently. You know, we still do have a lot of work to do. I will say that in Canada, we still have a lot of work to do. And I think that that's true globally as well, particularly in the areas of standards and professionalization, and ensuring that our work is well understood and recognized and valued. But there is an undeniable trend. And with that, I think, comes an irresistible opportunity for us to step forward and out of the shadows as a profession. I think it's time now for our field to be clear about our competence, our professionalism, and our impact. This is our collective context, perhaps as a global profession, but I also recognize that we each have our own unique country or regional contexts, and those unique contexts really matter. In the first part of this session, I'd like to share a bit now about our context, both so that our story, as we tell it over the next little while, makes sense to you because you have enough context to have it make sense, but also as an encouragement to each of you to be thinking about your own context as you listen to our story. You know, it never ever works to parachute as is an idea, a process, or an approach from one context to another, from one country to another, from one culture to another. You know, whether it's standards or anything else, context really matters. So as you're listening and participating today, I really encourage you to be thinking about your own context, your strengths, your challenges, your realities, and being aware that of course those must be taken into account, both in what you decide that you might want to do moving forward, and also how you will want to do it. And it will not likely be the same story as ours in Canada, but we do hope that as we share ours, there may be some seeds that help you in your own reflections. So we can go to the next slide. So let's start with where in the world we are. Some of you have already begun to use the chat, and I encourage you to use that liberally throughout the session. And if you haven't already done so, I'd invite you to share where you're joining from right now. So this being a virtual event means that I can join you from Ottawa, Canada. That's the capital of our country. In Canada, our tradition is always to begin a session by acknowledging the Indigenous owners of our land. Ottawa, where I live and where Philip, who will be co-presenting with me, lives, is the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Indigenous peoples. And I pay my respect to their culture and to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Where Philip and I live, we have 4 very distinct and beautiful seasons. And these photos were all taken near my home. The top left-hand corner captures what is probably the most beautiful season in Canada, in my part of the world, where all of the trees turn beautiful colors of gold and red and orange. And it's absolutely spectacular. The winter is what we are, of course, best known for, and we are in the middle of winter now. On a sunny day, it is beautiful, and I will say that we are absolutely snowed in. We have had more snow than any other part of Canada, and we have huge ranges of temperature. We can go from +40 in the summer to -40 in the winter. And it is close to -40 right now. We have a polar vortex coming in. In the summer, it's hot and humid here, and luckily we live close to lots of water. But right there in the middle is exactly where I'm joining you from, my little house in Ottawa. So it's a real pleasure to be here with you. So we can move to the next slide. So a little bit about the Canadian context. I thought it would be helpful to start today's session with just a bit of a story of where we started, because where we are now has been a long journey. We started really about 25 years ago when we decided that we wanted to try to establish standards, competency standards for practice in our field. And at the time, there was no role model. There was no example of a competency standard for career guidance in the world. And so we were starting with a blank slate. We began that process in 1996. And it took us several years. We didn't launch the standard until 2001. And that is because when you're starting from a blank slate, it takes time. It took time to get our field on board, to believe that having standards was a good idea, and to not feel too threatened by that idea. And then it took time to actually articulate the standards in a meaningful way that allowed people to actually see themselves in that standard, and for them to be meaningful and useful and relevant to their work. And so that was a journey that we started 25 years ago. And those standards held us in good stead. We used them as a country, and they were really helpful to us for almost 25 years. They were widely adopted and owned by the sector. I will say they were less adopted and owned by funders and employers. The people on the front lines of service who really helped us to actually create the standard did embrace them. And so they used them in their work. They often used them in thinking about their own training and development. Many of our training programs, whether they were in post-secondaries or our private deliverers, adopted them as the frame for the development and delivery of training for career guidance professionals. But the funders and those that were actually hiring career guidance professionals did not adopt them as much as we would have wished. So that was a learning for us in the early days. We did, over time, establish a number of certification programs, voluntary certification programs that were loosely based on our standard. Most of them required a combination of education and experience. The more education you had, the less experience you needed, and vice versa. But one province completely used the standard and created a competency-based certification. And so we had a little bit of a mishmash of different certifications across the country. We're a big, big country, and every region had its own certification. And so in 2018, there were two things that we were really wanting to do. One was, we knew that our work, the labor market had changed, our work had changed, and therefore our competency standard needed to change. We had tried to make little changes along the way and keep it as up to date as we could, but we knew that it needed to be really updated and really reimagined. And we also wanted to try to build more cohesion through a national certification approach rather than all of these regional certifications. We wanted to try to develop a national certification approach, and we were successful in getting federal government funding to do that. It was a 3-year initiative. And so we are now on the other end of that, really implementing the new standard and working towards implementing the new certification program. And so we can go to the next slide, which is really a snapshot of everything that was created in those 3 years, everything that we set out to achieve and more. We ended up doing more than we originally thought we would do. And I thought that I would just quickly give you a sense of what we accomplished, and then talk a little bit about why we did it. And then as we move into the session, I'll be joined by Philip, who really was our partner through all of this work. And together we'll dig in much more into sort of the details of how we did it. So in terms of what we did, the very first thing we did was to create a definition of career development professional. We use the words career development in Canada as opposed to career guidance. So I'm sorry, I slipped back into our Canadian terminology without meaning to, but so the definition of a career guidance practitioner was the very first thing we did, because we thought it was important to put our stake in the ground and define who we are. What is our scope of practice? What is our impact as career development professionals? And then we could go into the setting of the standard. But we thought it was important first to define who we are, to really articulate that clearly and comprehensively. And we have encouraged every single career service across Canada to put that definition on the wall in the reception area, so that anybody entering can see clearly who they're going to be meeting with. What is the definition of a career development professional, and who are we? What do we do? And what is our impact? So that's where we started. The second, of course, very big piece of work was the establishment of the new standard, the new competency framework. And so we did have an old competency framework, as I mentioned, and I think we moved into this process imagining that, yes, it would change, but I don't think we imagined how much it would change. We really did have a very rigorous process, which you'll hear about. And part of that process meant that we had to be ready for what emerged from the process. We had to trust the process and its rigor, that it would result in the right competencies being articulated. And in fact, they were quite different from our original competencies. And so we ended up with about 100 competencies in our framework. We can talk a little bit more in detail about the framework itself and how what emerged, how it's structured. But it is really like a library of competencies that can be grouped and organized in different ways. We have grouped them in some ways already. So we did want to pull out those competencies that are core or essential for anybody who is doing work in the career area. So whether you work in a school, whether you work in the community, whether you work in a workplace with corporate career development, or whether you are in a post-secondary, wherever you are working and whoever you are working with, the National Competency Profile articulates the competencies that you should have if you are a competent and ethical professional. And they comprise kind of two sets of competencies, some that are competencies that we share with lots of other service providers. They're sort of human relationship competencies, and some are unique to career guidance. And so that competency profile became our national standard and the basis for certification. There are also some specialized competencies that you might need depending on where you work, but those core essential competencies are the underpinnings for certification. We also, we did have a code of ethics, but again, we have now a much different and really reimagined code of ethics. It is extraordinarily comprehensive. It is completely mapped and aligned to the competency framework. And it is something that we are very, very proud of. It was a massive amount of work to create it. And we think we have something, well, we feel very grounded by it. And it really is a guide to our service. We obviously have a website, which I hope that you'll visit. And we have a self-assessment tool that allows our practitioners to self-assess themselves against the competency framework as a means to help them to think through the kind of training and professional development that they might want to pursue, as well as identify their current strengths. And then we developed some training and micro-credentials to support the initiative as well. So that is the what, and I recognize that's a really quick tour through the what, but we will be coming back and digging into more detail into particularly the competency framework part of that. So the why. Why did we go down this road? I loved Manuela's comment that, some of us are allergic to rules. I think that I'm somebody who's allergic to rules. I don't deal well with rules, but I have come to love these rules, I will say, because I've really seen the benefit of having a clear standard that is built by our field and therefore really owned by our field and embraced by our field. We have seen benefits for our profession broadly, for the career guidance profession in Canada. We have certainly seen benefits for individual career practitioners, people working on the front lines, delivering services. We have seen benefits to employers and to funders. We're still struggling to get them to see the benefits, but we have seen the benefits. And we really believe there are benefits to the public. So let me just dig into each of those very briefly before we were joined by Philip. So benefits to our profession. So to the whole sector of career guidance. Certainly for us, having a clear standard and in our case, moving toward a national certification has been really helpful in terms of visibility. It has made us more visible. It has raised the bar and created a sense of professional excellence in our field, which I think has given us the confidence to step out and talk more about what we do. We are talking more to governments. We are talking more to the media. We are stepping out and being more visible. And I think that part of that is because we have the sense of professional excellence sort of on our shoulders. It has been really helpful in terms of clarity for our sector. It has created a widely accepted common language and common standard with measurable competencies. So the clarity, particularly in this second round of our competency framework, we have very clearly defined measurable standards that don't leave a whole lot of room for interpretation. And so that shared clarity has been very helpful for our profession. And of course, accountability. It really gives us a clear sense of both who we are and what we are accountable for. In terms of benefits for individual career development or career guidance professionals, again, that clarity is extremely helpful. Knowing the competencies that are expected of me, but also knowing that I can assess it myself against them and build towards mastery. It has, I think, encouraged more training programs to be established. It has created demand. So I have, as a career guidance professional, I have more choice now around training. Obviously, recognition and status. Having achieved the standard, being certified is a visible standard and a visible sign of recognition. And as an individual professional who pursues that, it creates opportunities. In a competitive market, it makes the career professional more attractive to an employer if they're coming with the achievement of the standard and being certified. And of course, a sense of professionalism and sort of being established as an expert. It really clearly has articulated our scope of expertise, and having that clearly defined is really reinforces our sense of being experts. In terms of employers and funders, there's some assurance when there's a clear standard and when somebody is certified, you know that they have met that standard, and you know that they are committed to lifelong continuing education. That provides some assurance to an employer who's thinking about hiring a career guidance professional, or funding an organization. If they are staffed with certified professionals, then that gives the funder a level of assurance. And of course, you know, from an HR perspective as an employer, having a standard is incredibly useful from a practical point of view. It can help you in developing job descriptions. It can help you in developing training plans, and it can help you with your HR management in terms of thinking about who is best qualified to play various roles and how you might help your staff to develop. It provides a really clear path in terms of HR management. And of course, for employers and funders, it also, you know, being able to say that you hire professionals who have met a standard provides you with visibility and status. And our research is pretty clear that when you do employ competent, qualified professionals, that your outcomes are better. And so from a funder perspective, there's a strong argument for that. It's an argument that we in Canada are still making, and we haven't been fully successful yet, but we're on it. And then finally, the public. I think that one is kind of obvious. You know, when there is a clear standard for a service that you're going to be using, you can make informed choices. You know what you can expect, and you can be a wise consumer of that service, and it provides protection, you know, against poor service, and really does increase the chances that as a member of the public seeking career services, you're going to get quality service. And so with that, that was our why. We're going to move in to much more detail to talk through not only a bit more about the what, but also the how we proceeded in the establishment of our standards. But I do share the website of where all the information, everything that we produced is freely available on that website. You're welcome to look at it, welcome to use it in whatever way would be most useful to you. And so with that, I'll pause for now and welcome any questions at this stage.
Thank you so much, Serena. That was really a beautiful introduction, and I liked a lot the way how you presented. It was very personal, creating good start. So you must be a professional career guidance practitioner.
and proud to be so.
Thanks so much, really. We actually do have one question from Emil from Serbia. I hope I pronounced your name correctly, asking, are you actually able to keep up with the dynamic demands of the labor market?
Oh, it's a great question, and it's there's no question it's a challenge. I mean, already, so we launched our standard in 2021. I look at it today, and there are many things that I would change already. You know, it has. I'll give you one concrete example. It's become very clear in our public employment service in Canada that we have traditionally focused very much on the supply side of the labor market. And by that, I mean, we have tended to focus on individuals and tended to focus on individuals who are unemployed or underemployed. We have focused less on working individuals and less on employers and providing services to those that are really in a workplace, whether they are workers or employers. And in this labor market in Canada, we have the historic low levels of unemployment. And so there are actually very few people who are unemployed relative to normal times. And so we're seeing that for us to remain relevant as a field, we have to be working more with working individuals and with employers. And that's a different set of competencies. So that's just one concrete example, but And Philip will probably talk a bit about this as well, but once you have developed the standard, your work is not done. There is an ongoing review process that needs to be in place to be always having your eye on what's happening in the labor market, what's happening in your profession, and what needs to change as a result. You can't change it constantly, but you do need a cycle in place. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Serena. We will come back actually to that point a bit later in today's meeting. And Rodion, thanks a lot for your question. In fact, our next speaker will answer that question. So please be patient. And I'm happy to introduce to all of you now Philip Mondor. He is President and CEO of the Canadian Tourism HR Council. And as Serena mentioned, he was really a strategic partner in the development of the Canadian standards. And he will give us all the details now about how they went about the development of their standards. So Philip, over to you, please.
Thank you so much, Florian. I should mention to everyone that it might seem a little bit odd that this guy from the Tourism Council is working with Serena's group, but it's not unusual at all. As an organization, our mandate is to build a resilient and competitive and inclusive workforce. And indeed, we employ one of the largest workforces in Canada with about 11% of it attributed to this sector. But what's more important is we have an affinity to the whole career field as well in terms of our mandate. And as an organization, we do this work with a number of other industries. In fact, we've done similar work with 20 industrial sectors and in actually 15 countries. So it's just a natural sort of a place for us to be. And indeed, it's very close to home. So it was a true partnership working forward. So what I want to do today is start off with, I sort of put this into two sections. One was the logic process right up front. How do we even get out of the gate with some fundamental decisions which help really define how we need to work, what kind of a standard we effectively need to produce, and then I'll get into the actual process that we followed. This logic that we're going to talk about in this first section is no different than it would be with any other group. It really is about trying to set some parameters, if you want, to make sure that we address the objectives that are set out by the sector or the field of practice that's there, acknowledging that there are many different models that one can employ. So with that in mind, and again, I've had to be selective with a number of the slides I'm using here. There is so much more depth to this discussion. So you'll notice that I'll be quick on a few slides, but for the benefit of the group, I'd rather try to go through the entire process, let people reflect, and of course, they'll have access to this PowerPoint deck thereafter. So to begin with, when we do these processes, of course, the place to start is to ask, why? Why are we doing it? What's the point and what's the problem we're solving? When we started to explore this question, are the emergent points. And in many ways, that's not particularly unique to this sector, but it certainly is indicative of the time in terms of acknowledging the need to elevate people's understanding of this field of practice, how important it is. When I reflect on this, the timing of this was very lucky at the same time, because in a pre-pandemic environment, there was already heightened understanding of the need for this field of practice to be better recognized and understood. But I can assure you as well that as we moved into the pandemic and the tail end of this project, and now as we sort of see ourselves coming out of it, I'm going to suggest that it's never been more important. And so hopefully the kind of investment that's made here will make a difference. But you can see it's really about the professionalization of the sector, giving it more visibility and the kinds of things that both Serena and Manuela mentioned. The next kind of question we like to get into, though, before we figure out precisely the methodology, gets at a bit of how the standard would be applied, for what purpose. There are many models that one can employ, and I'll get into that a little bit about what we've actually employed. But in many ways, it comes down to the application of it, this the level of the stakes at hand and how it's applied. And then it gets into discussion about what level of specificity is necessary in the standard. And to put it simply, the higher the stakes for things like recognition of someone's competency, which is what we would describe as a professional certification program, effectively is the highest stakes. And we argue that there is a need for the highest level of specificity, if you want, or explicit information in there in order to inform that model so that it's legally defensible. Of course, if you're going to produce a standard that can satisfy that range, it can address many other needs along that continuum, right from basic information provision around the nature of the work, right through to helping design training programs, assessment models, and so on. The model for this field of practice was aiming to achieve that certification program. So we went with an understanding that we would be designing something with a lot of specificity and range of context. The other thing that comes into question, though, is what benchmark do you want to set this at? When you look at models across the globe, you will notice that there are many practices that are defined as what we would call entry to practice, or just what it looks like to have be minimally qualified, if you like. Now, there's different language around this, but you can also look at examples where you may want to be looking at something that is really about a fully proficient individual or a so-called high performer. Again, with the interest of moving to a professional credential and certification that was pan-Canadian in scope and covered most of the kinds of practitioners that are involved in this field, we knew that we needed to benchmark at a fully professional level. That's not to say that many of the standards in here would not also apply to entry to practice, but indeed we needed to cover the range or the scope that spoke to the consummate professional, if you like. And in so doing, that does mean that as we were working through the defining of the respective standards, we really model it against thinking about it through this kind of classical curve, as you want, and basically aim to kind of get it at the so-called high but attainable level. So it's beyond just average performers per se. It's really trying to identify a standard that's progressive but still attainable by most. And of course, there will be practitioners that could be beyond that, but it's to apply to the most environments. And if you look at a natural distribution curve, we know that in pretty much any social science context, you're going to find a lot of workers in that middle band. The aim here is to try to elevate the standard a little bit, or encourage people to reach the higher aims where possible. The other question, of course, we would ask right up front is, well, what kind of information do we need to collect? What does the standard need to contain? This slide is really just a placeholder to show you the range of types of content that might be included. Indeed, there could be others as well. So we went through an exploratory process around this and did identify critically what was essential, what was good to have. And then with that, it informed the details of the methodology itself. Related to this point, in Canada, about 15 years ago, a little more than that perhaps, one of the efforts we were doing collectively at the national level with organizations like Serena's, like mine, and others who are in this space was set a standard for setting standards. And while we met that model, one of the foundational pieces within it was actually some defining of principles that would apply when designing these kinds of instruments. That work I was instrumental in helping set up at the time, but as we moved, that's some 15 plus years ago, as we were moving into work with Serena's group, we also did some updating around this methodology. And what you see on the screen, this is a whole presentation on its own, by the way, speaks to the principles that also underpin all of the work itself. This is very important, I might add, in terms of compliance with these principles, because it's what helps us achieve the standard that the industry trusts and buys into, if you want, but it really is fundamental to our ability to engage the stakeholders and to get the kind of currency with the standard that people can work with. So there's much to be said about this slide alone, and that could be a presentation onto itself, but it underpins virtually all aspects and all phases that you'll see. Finally, we did, as a group, articulate the main guiding principles that were the goal with the development of the competency framework for CCDF. These are the items you see on the screen, and I'll probably mention these as I move through the presentation in terms of how we were moving towards that. But I mean, some of this is pretty obvious, but not to be lost, not to lose sight of along the way. I mean, obviously, they needed to be easy to understand and practical because of the application of these standards across many different market bases, like not just for the practitioners themselves, but rather for government or policymakers, for education bodies, and so on. One of the mantras that was common that our team would use when we're setting standards is to make sure that these things were explicit. We'd always say, the test here is to know, would your mother-in-law understand what we've put on the table here? Is it explicit sufficiently for them? And that's kind of an example of how we would satisfy number one. We also, and I won't go through all of these, but another example would be the idea of future-oriented. We know that standards need to be dynamic and adaptive over time. Serena already alluded to some of that, but there are things within our methodology that have us project, that look into where we believe the field of practice is shifting. In fact, even the example that Serena raised right up front around more connection with employers emerged in the model. And there were standards created for that. Probably there needs to be more expansion on that as we speak today. And I'll use one more example on the screen, and that's the idea of scalable. We know that the field was also growing, and as people appreciate I'll say the essential nature of the services provided, it's also true that we anticipate over time that this field of practice will be more adaptive to yet further demands on it. And that idea of scalability is an acknowledgement that we had to structure something where the standard itself could be adaptive over time. And again, there's lots of other matters within here, but because of time, we'll move forward. Now, the other final sort of quick note up front is we wanted to make sure we were operating within an appropriate scope. And although there were definitions that we identified around what does this role look like, we really did need to reframe it and get people thinking critically about it. Now, there are many types of career practitioners, but what we wanted to set as a standard here is one that would apply to most practitioners in most settings. And so when you set a national standard of this type, it's important that you define something that most will find themselves in. There's always going to be some exceptions, but we came to a point where we ended up with the definition you see on the screen. Too much to read for today, but this was the first stage of getting a full ratification around it. So we had all kinds of processes where we got the industry collective to sanction this. And then this became the guideposts for the scope of the actual content itself. I think it's held up well. It really did expand people's thinking right out of the gate about the role of this field of practice. And with that in mind, not to preempt where we landed, but eventually what that led to was the codifying of how we looked at the standards for this field. And it's summarized into this image, this diagram that was effectively what we filled this vessel, if you want. You heard Serena speak a little bit to it, but effectively there are 4 categories, if you like, of the competencies within this library, and we ended up labeling them as you see on the screen. Because of the time today, I won't go into this in detail. Again, that could be a presentation unto itself about all of the content and specific elements. But bottom line, we noticed the need for the foundational standards, which applied not only to this field of practice, but to a lot of affiliated fields where there was a common reality. And then you start to move into sort of areas of degrees of specialization, you could say, in the field. So those that are uniquely characteristic to career development practitioners, as we call them, and then the advanced and leadership areas really speak to the evolving nature of the field and the specializations within it. Now, in a dynamic model that's set up here, the reality is that this is not static. There are, over time, you could imagine that the competencies could migrate in between any one of those categories effectively, but we shouldn't be too caught up on that. It was really just in order for us to be mindful of the range that we needed to cover, the context we were addressing, and so on. So there's other decision points up front, but to capsulate what we looked at, it's really those areas that informed much of how we went about going through the process. Now, if you'd like, I can stop here for a brief Q&A, although I know it's a bit tricky because some of the answers might just simply be revealed as I start to walk through the actual process, but maybe just as a check and balance before I get into the depth of how we went about doing this. I'll pause and see if there's any pressing questions or clarity that might be needed.
Thanks a lot, Philip, for that first round of presentation. There is actually two questions. So from Rodion before, maybe you come to that later. If so, then just we wait to your answer. He asks what tools or mechanisms you have passed the identification phase of the profession. What have you developed? Have you developed occupational standards or a similar document? And Fusun asking, first of all, congratulating you, Fusun from Turkey. Could you talk on how occupational standards and qualifications are placed in the national qualifications framework? You anticipated that question when we prepared for that meeting. And would you also consider integrating social inclusion in the definition of the career guidance professional?
Well, again, there are perfect questions, and I believe that what I'm about to walk through will probably answer most of that, although I'm happy to expand on some of that context at the end at the same time. On the last question asked about expansion of the definition, I don't want to speak for Serena precisely, but I'm going to suggest that the will and the intent would always be to be adaptive to the changes that are there. And indeed, there's always room for that definition to be adjusted. And I would assume over time that exact would occur. And I mean, I don't want to speak for Serena's group, but that's the nature of doing a good standard, is the dynamic aspects of it, an acknowledgement, as I was alluding to in my last few slides, that the field has to emerge as well, and indeed it is. And sometimes, by the way, it's just a change of language that's reflecting the current practices, but it's more vogue to adjust to those circumstances as well.
And perhaps I'll just add, I did respond to Fusun's very, very astute comment around the inclusion of sort of social inclusion, social justice. I think it's a great example of how these are dynamic processes, you know, whether it's the standard, whether it's the definition of career guidance professional. Our work is never done because our work is constantly changing. Before we move into the development process, I do think that our Canadian approach was a bit unique in that the first time we developed our competency framework 25 years ago, we did it by ourselves. And I would say in hindsight, we did not know what we did not know. We knew our practice, and therefore we had content expertise. But to be honest, we didn't even know that there was a domain of expertise around the establishment of occupational standards. We just didn't know that there's a whole domain, and there are standards around how to establish standards. And you know, there are ISO standards related to the development of standards. And so a big learning for us was that we didn't know what we didn't know. And partnering with Philip's group was a revelation, I will say, for us. We learned so much in the process. And I will say with complete certainty that what emerged as outputs of the process were infinitely stronger by virtue of partnering with an external group that had an interest in our field, but brought the expertise around how to establish a standard and how to move toward certification in a rigorous way. So that partnership of we had the career guidance expertise, they had the expertise around the methodology of creating a standard and the rigor associated with that. And when you brought those together, it really did create some magic from our perspective. So, and I guess just the other piece in terms of the preparatory phase that Philip was talking about, from our perspective, of course, part of that phase was seeking funding. So this is not something that can be done for free. It takes time, it takes human resources, and it takes financial resources to do it. And I think just one last comment about the preparatory phase was, and it's coming back to my comment about the importance of context. When we first developed the standard 25 years ago, our context was very different. And, people were suspicious, and, who were we talking about establishing a standard, and what would that mean? And would they be excluded by it? 25 years later, we really did have trust and relationship, and we had been working together with all of the associations across the country for that whole period of time. And so we had a sense that we were all working toward this together. And so this time around, there were different issues, but having the right voices around the table and having that relationship of collaboration was really in place. So that context was very different. So again, as I said at the beginning, think about your own context, your own country context, and where you are in terms of the right people being already at the table, the right voices being part of the process. Those considerations are really, really important at the front end.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Shall we go into the next phase? And we'll take the second question of Emil later, okay? Thanks.
Yes, and I do think some of that might come out of this, but we'll have a good time at the end to help frame a little bit more. So thank you for that. Now I'm going to get into the development phase. I'm going to try to strike a balance here of not being too technical, but sort of provide enough that people really get a feel for the process. And it's probably worth saying right up front, picking up on just the last few comments of Serena. In this model, the approach is an industry-led one. And what I mean by that is it's government supported. There are all of the kinds of stakeholders at the table, but to be really clear, it's industry-led. And this is important in terms of thinking about the model itself, that having the right governance structure around this matters, and that the fact that CCDF exists and has the right governance approach enables a lot of this to happen. It would have been a different starting point had that not been the case. I'll leave it at that and park that point, but we can always pick up on it. Okay, for anyone that's heard me speak about this before, this is my sort of infamous starting point, but in some ways, I think this is pretty much the whole presentation on one slide. If there's anything that the process is about, it in the end is about setting a standard that is trusted and that supports the kind of influence necessary for those standards to be employed. So embodied within this entire next 50 slides is to meet basically this one aim. That may sound a little simple, but there's a lot of complexity to it. It's much more than a technical exercise. As I've said many times, and I'm sure Serena may have heard, you've heard of her to say the same, in a technical sense, we could have had a team write this in the ivory tower and just put it out there, and it would have looked like a good standard. In fact, it would have been a great standard, but it's not the same aim. It wouldn't have the same currency in the marketplace. And there's lots to be said about the process itself that builds this trust and builds influence and helps inform what's happening from a delivery point of view, from a policy point of view, and so on. There's detail you can talk about what we mean by that. I've included one slide just for the sake of interest here, but to do that, there are some tenets. We want to make sure the methodology is is trusted. It's got the right governance attached to it, that there are right decision processes, that we have those guiding principles, etc. And then finally, just before I get into the very specific model, and this is to pick up on a question that came about in advance as well. Often people ask, did we follow a DACOM approach? Again, I've done this work in some 15 countries. This is kind of the first question I'm routinely asked. And DACOM, of course, has a lot of merit. It's well known as a kind of model that is particularly prevalent in North America. And indeed, it has some elements here that make sense. But what we also know is that there are many different methods to begin to set standards around either what would be characterized as work-oriented or worker-oriented. In my view, and in our experience, none of them are ideal. They all have very specific applications, and they serve well in those specific applications. DACOM, for example, fundamentally intended to help design curriculum largely in a tertiary post-secondary system, as one example, and I don't want to overly generalize. The reality is that when we look at this, Canadians did a big study on this as part of our work as a national group, but we basically look at it through a hybrid approach. We borrow from a number of these and identify what is the best fit for purpose. And that speaks a bit to some of the earlier slides I had in the preamble. And the model, therefore, is one that's a hybrid, and you'll see an image of it in the next slide. So what is it that we did? Just in case we're not clear still, we basically, it's a library of competencies, as Serena said, and I won't say more about it for now, but you can have different definitions around that as well. And I think it'll become more clear as I now walk through these next series. So what does this hybrid model look like? Well, it's nice to have visuals. It's nice when we're working with groups to have them see where they are in these phases. And although this looks like it's one step after another, and mostly it does follow this order, as you can appreciate that it's as a sort of social process, a social science, there's a little bit of fluidity here, but effectively these are the stages that one would follow. That first cluster is really about setting the groundwork. And I'll walk through each of these in subsequent slides. But from our point of view, until you're well situated with getting organized on those groundwork exercises, there's no merit in moving forward, because you will run into different kinds of challenges and in fact not be well poised for success. But once that is well situated, then we move into a development phase. From a resource point of view, this occupies most of the resources and time. It's intensive. You'll see me spend more time on that section of the presentation to walk through it. But it's a dynamic model, and it's not meant to be static for lots of reasons. There is also the whole stages of what happens once the standards are set, how they're applied, and what occurs with them. And wrapping around all of this is an understanding that it's not just the content of the standard itself that you need to worry about. It's also around the administration of those standards and how they're supported, and in fundamentally the governance structure itself. Without that, these standards would languish, and they would not have be useful in the marketplace. So it's a more holistic approach, if you want. It's content, but it's also around the administration or the management of that content, and around the governance of it, or the oversights to ensure that those standards are maintained. Okay, so to walk through this, I'll walk through each of these, some in more detail than others. I will flip through some of these rapidly where it's not maybe as important to go through with the time that we have. But in that first phase of planning and initiation, there are four sort of sub-elements that we work through. The first is really about the feasibility of this. Now, this may seem a little simple, but having worked with many clients, it really is foundational. And it may sound a little crazy if you want, but often people have goodwill to get moving on this, but haven't done the groundwork. We ask the question, is this what problem are we solving? In our experience, we often discover that it's not the standards that might solve the problem for them. There may be actually other more rudimentary or other things that they need to focus on first and may not be in a position to be working on a standard yet. There's a demand. Now, even if there isn't, from a market point of view, there might still be a demand, for say, from a policy point of view or other sort of drivers of it. But we want to understand that context, because the due diligence of knowing how to incorporate that understanding of what the purpose is and its application matters. What sort of factors might constrain the work itself? Because we need to factor that in. And finally, what resources are needed? So this may seem basic, but there's a lot embedded in understanding these in order to set a good plan. And of course, then you set the plan. It should have multiple elements to it, the classic stuff you see on the screen. But if there's one I'll hone in on, it is fundamentally, and this is a critical area, the stakeholder engagement plan. Stakeholder engagement is really at the main tenet of the model. Without it, it's most like that comment I made earlier. You'll get a technical standard, but you may not get one that's trusted. You may not earn that influence. It may simply not get the currency that's needed. Now, stakeholder engagement plans should be comprehensive, and they can take on many forms. But fundamentally, we suggest that you need at least subject matter experts at the table. After all, they're most impacted by the standard, and they should inform what the standard contains. Clearly, job incumbents are important to that role. So we do want at the table consummate professionals, experts, people that have tenured experience and have the range of experience that we're talking about in terms of who the standard applies. But we also know that sometimes it's important to go beyond just those working in the field. And I don't mean it in a sort of in a dismissive way, but rather there are emergent elements of the field. And there may be highly specialized areas where we do need other subject experts brought in. Some of it may relate to regulation and so on. So identifying who needs to be at the table becomes important from a content point of view. And the disproportionate number of people we need to engage should be in this category. We also want to, of course, have a steering committee. It needs to be a trusted body. Of course, those by which we can exercise some influence. In the end, their role will be to sanction the work and to oversee what's happening along the way. So they're important to the industry in terms of their function in this and the guidance around it. They are monitoring the quality, the compliance. They're making sure that the work plan is followed as was sanctioned, because their job in the end is going to be very important. We'll come back to them, but their job in ratifying what is done is the sort of final stamp of approval. And without it, we would not declare that the standard itself is complete. Of course, engagement involves more than those players. The administrative team itself is another narrative around engagement. If you look at this example, there was the expertise of Serena's team as subject experts, and then there's the technical team on my end. Of course, we need to learn to work together and manage the different dynamics of it. So engagement there is an exercise unto itself. We also, as an extension of that, often involve, where the client or where the partner is supportive of it, individuals that are part of the technical network we have that are not subject matter experts that we may bring in from time to time to do a check and balance on how we're proceeding with these things. So this engagement plan takes some time to produce. There's a number of tools and elements in order to attract the people we need to this, and then to maintain those relationships along the way. When we're thinking about stakeholder engagement, one of the other principles that we have is really around understanding that everyone is individual, they're all different, and we want to optimize engagement wherever possible. So it's not a one size fits all. We do look at ways in which we basically find ways in which people cannot not engage, right? Like the idea that there's no excuse, you have to be at the table. So what you see on the screen is just an example, and it's kind of how what would emerged in this project. Something as simple as just being on the list where they'd be informed on what's happening, right through to people who, of course, were more engaged in actually supplying content. There were those that helped extend the work through networks and more leadership roles. So articulating different ways in which people can engage and ensuring that you can accommodate them mattered. We went out of our way to do this, whether it was different language options or different ways. Like we would be talking to some people literally at 3 o'clock in the morning if that was when they were available to connect, as examples. So support around these processes when you make yourself available, making sure that you can make this available to individuals or groups. These are all sort of dynamics around what the elements of an engagement plan contains. Finally, one last thing you see on the screen here, I put in orange text, is this point around informed consent. It's one thing to broadcast and attract people and get them signing up for these things. But what we're really adamant about is they really understand their commitment to the process. And so a kind of final stage of this exercise of engagement is really to get these people to sign off what they're committing to. And that's a process of informed consent. There's other reasons for that. It's also because what we're collecting as information is important that we are able to defend. And this is going to be information that becomes intellectual property ultimately, that's used for multiple purposes, et cetera. So understanding the way in which that operates matters, and if there's limitations around it and so on. Now, who needs to be involved? Our general statement here would be the more the better. Stakeholders are broad and far and wide, perhaps arguably some more important than others, but a normal process would be to think about all of them and suggest what it is that, why they would be involved and what's important. Of course, we did that in this process and did try to get as many as we could across the band of these. And again, most of them would have been around job incumbents, academics in the field, and other policymakers that were important. But the sum total of the effort is to make sure definitively that we could declare that we were inclusive of the range of career development practitioners that we wanted to represent, that we were diverse, that it was representative geographically, et cetera. And so that was kind of the overall modeling of that process. Still within that first category, then, once you've got that engagement strategy in place, it's a lot about us starting to collect information about the field. And there's many ways to go about that, but it's your classic research approach, if you want. The more ways we could access and tap into information, the better. So we did employ a number of elements. There are classic things you might see. Now, the thing about designing standards for a field is we also know that it's really important to get as many live face-to-face interactions where possible. So more weight is put on focus groups, more weight is put on those structured interviews we had with subject matter experts. They just bring to life the discussions and the ability to clarify and to really explore or discover areas that you're just not going to find in other ways. But it has to be an informed process. So, looking at what's happening in literature, doing survey work to corroborate what we discover, all of these methods matter. It's really about understanding the value behind what the method could bring and then how you employ it in the model. But where we had resources, disproportionately, the idea of convening people and having those discussions is always the most value-based approach. So, I'll flip to these next ones quickly just because of time, but obviously the web research was your classic thing. We looked globally, we looked across other industries, we looked at what was in this industry itself, and the technical team consolidates and brings all of that together and looks for patterns, looks for areas of anomaly, looks for emergent kinds of issues. It's an interesting body of work, and it sets the foundation for us, because when we start bringing people together, we can ask all the hard questions. Like, why do we have these anomalous things described about that practice? Or, we see a little thing of emergent practice somewhere, or is it just, does it apply or not apply kind of thing? But there's also, you discover all kinds of wild ways in which these practices are described. The terms and verbs used are all over the map. And so we're just starting to consolidate this in a way that we can start to ask the hard questions to bring clarity to it. And with that, then, once we pull that together, we start to convene players. So focus group sessions, as I talked about, were one of those methods. Of course, there were surveys produced and other things. One of the, I'll call it slight innovations we employed with this group because of the limitations on time, on resources, on the fact that geographic representation, and the aim of trying to get as many involved as possible, is we did employ these what we called coffee consultation sessions, which meant that we, at a very regional level, had, I think, 65 sessions where leaders in the industry took on the charge of hosting very localized events. That gave us the outreach, but of course we prepared them with the instruments and the tools, and our technical people were available to answer questions along the way or to intervene. This enabled us to also deal with different languages and different range of context. And I must say, from an engagement point of view, is a very strategic approach, because it's also, for some participants, more accessible and more friendly when they could have those intimate discussions with tables of 5 or 8 at a local level. So there's a whole process around that, but basically these are the attempts to get as many convening opportunities face-to-face where possible. We also did interviewing of subject matter experts. These were structured interviews. These were usually the follow-up after we did most of the focus group kinds of things, when we started to further refine content and needed to flesh out or respond to areas that were still not sufficiently, that we weren't satisfied with for whatever those reasons may be. And that took on different forms. And again, we went after subject experts there depending on where the needs were. And some of them were not always just career practitioners. They might have been people that set policy, for example. We also did collect what was the tools they worked with, the kinds of forms, the kinds of understanding about the workplace environment. Because when you're setting a standard, we also needed to be very sure that the kinds of protocols or requirements one might include reflected the context in which they had to operate. Now, it's a quick snapshot just to give you a flavor. I mean, this is, you can come back to this slide, but Canada geographically is immense. It's complicated, it's federal. It's not maybe dissimilar to the sort of a European Union concept, but these were sort of what we achieved within just a few weeks, by the way, of consultations, where we had a lot of efforts occurring simultaneously and iteratively over these periods of time. It's an impressive volume and very substantive amount that we collected across these centers with all of this engagement. And I must say, there's something to be said about that as well. It's a significant sample when you look at the range. And there's data to show that it was representative, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, finally, on the last of the first of those phases around the framework design, I won't go into much detail about that because you saw the general frame of it at the beginning, but basically we ended up with those 4 broad categories and started to map our competencies within that framework. Okay, moving on to the development phase. The development phase, you got a bit of a feel for that just by virtue of that first area, but to be very clear that once all those consultations are done, in some ways this is when a lot of hard work happens. I mean, the consultations in themselves, don't get me wrong, they're not hard work. They're very interesting and informative. But getting the standard pulled together is where some very interesting things start to occur. So to start off with, we needed to, and this is where, again, it's a bit, I don't want to put the cart before the horse, but this in a way preempts a little bit of what I was describing earlier, but it's related to the process. When we look at how we want to structure the content, like what is the standard going to be, how's it going to be set up? we've of course had those decision points a little bit earlier in the process, but as we knock out the drafting, this is where maybe it was easy to put it forward, but a competency or an occupational standard or a functional standard or other terms that could be used around this, there are many different choices you could have around it. But building on the narrative about our aims and other factors I mentioned in the preamble, it gets down to looking at the broad frameworks that are out there. And basically, there are three characteristic dimensions you'll see in the research, and they fall into these three categories. From the parlance used in Canada, most of us prefer to talk about defining the skills that people need, or what they need to perform, what they need to know, and what sort of attributes are important to them. And there's, of course, different ways to characterize this. What we settled on as the way to describe the focus was, in the end, in these standards, to define what they needed to be able to perform within the right context and what they needed to know. Now, let me expand on this a little bit. It's not that we were ignoring, by the way, the attributes or the attitudinal things, but they're embedded within our performance statements and our knowledge statements, and they were made more explicit from a measurement point of view that way. Okay, so on the performance front, as we start to write the standard and all of that inquiry we had with our consultations, really the structure of our methodology, the way our analysts probe these questions, what they're basically asking in a friendly language is, what are the cognitive, psychomotor issues and so on that they need to perform. Now, they don't use that language per se, but the depth of the questions are really us trying to tabulate all of that defines performance. So we are basically asking questions, get at these four dimensions. And we're doing it in a way that we want to make sure that it's applying to the vast majority, I prefer to say most practitioners in the whole range of contexts. So there is a whole staged way to frame this, but then we get at the questions, and basically we're trying to fill the vessel, making sure we're comprehensive and covering these four dimensions of performance. There is some other little detailed science here. This may be too much for today, but there's also decisions around how we draft these. And I can tell you that this can vary depending on the cultural context in which you're operating. But in our context, we know that writing this in an active verb matters, in a present tense, and that helps define it as a standard. Having worked with groups in other countries, I might add that sometimes is a different variable, but the present tense active verb simple form was a hard and fast rule about the way we were producing some of that content. Okay, so an example of what that looks like is on the screen, but for time, I won't bother. You can read some of this later. But it's a very deliberate choice of verbs. It's a very deliberate tense that's there, and it's declarative, basically. Okay, the knowledge, similar idea, similar concept, and knowledge, of course, takes on different forms. But much like I said in the last grouping, basically our analysts are probing for trying to get the range of knowledge, how it manifests, both in terms of facts or theories or procedural things they may do, maybe even metacognition that comes out of the field as a result of their practices. It too is declarative, very careful choice of verbs. And the knowledge in a way is responding to performance. In other words, we define the performance dimensions first, and then we beg the questions. Okay, if they need to perform those in that range of context, et cetera, then what do they need to know to do that? And that's effectively how we start to knock out the knowledge elements. And then there are other considerations. We know that there are variables that could occur. And so there are ways that we start to probe a little deeper on that, because it's not that you want to water down the standard, but there's clearly a standard, but then the standard may also have other conditions that need to be considered if the normal work context is adjusted. And so there are a sort of level of probing that goes beyond. Once the performance and knowledge our statements are well situated, we start to say, okay, but what about these range of contexts that come about? We've identified a few variables. Let's make sure that we get them articulated. And the variables, by the way, we go back on the knowledge and performance statements to make sure that they support the variables that may come about. Finally, the team, before it's ready to go to getting further in consultation and move into validation stages, basically go through a comprehensive approach of begging the questions we start to get into with where we will go with validation. Is it complete, accurate, etc.? And so once we've got those formative drafts, we go back to the marketplace, and we get involvement again, where we have formative drafts, and we're now back at the road with focus groups with all of that content, and they are feeding into these processes. We're getting beyond those consultations. We start then getting corroborating information. If they raise examples, they state facts, we go verify them. If they have contradictions about it, we go look for reasons why those contradictions exist, and we bring it back to the groups to get some resolve on it. So it's one of those normal qualitative models where it's really a back and forth, an iterative process of engaging with the subject experts and getting eventually sign off and endorsement of the final statements around it. Then we go to validation. Validation, I put a lot of weight into. It's perhaps arguably more important than the development per se, insofar as this is where I guess the test of the methodology comes into play. But it's really about verifying that not only did we get the content right, but rather did we meet the objectives that were set out and the rigor that was defined by those principles and the intent around how the standard would be applied, etc. So there are multiple stages of consideration here, and I'll walk through each of them just to make sure that we met those aims. First, it's around the validation of the content. Again, we go back to the industry with our penultimate drafts of these standards, extensive sort of efforts to get them to review, and they have to define, is it complete, is it accurate, etc. They understand it. And only when we've got full agreement on it do we feel comfortable that we can proceed. Sorry about that mark in there. I don't know how I got that in there. Secondly, while that's happening, and then at the end of all of that process, the analysts and other technical experts are still looking at it in a more global lens. We are looking at it from a point of view of the entire bank of competencies and the framework itself, asking ourselves, is there concordance? Is there some oddity that shows up where there's contradictory points? Is it still aligned with any regulation that the industry should be concerned with? By the way, if we discover something in regulations along the way, and this did happen and this does happen, that are also contradictory to what practice suggests, or there's contradictory regulations impacting the sector, there's a whole other process we're following outside of this that occurs. Did we meet the objectives, etc.? And that's a pretty high bar to meet, I might add. It raises a lot of interesting debate and challenge and conundrum on our part, but we're mindful of this and adamant that we need sufficient sign off before we're comfortable that this was met. Now, what you might notice in here is that there's probably sense that there's a lot of other stuff that was happening along the way, like a style guideline. Even as one of the foundational things is we also agreed on a style guideline for this project so that the language used was going to be consistent and consistent with other practices that CCDF operates with. So language and terms and the validation of terms along the way were embedded within a style guideline. So again, more depth, but it gives you a feel for what we are in the end having to come back and reconcile and make sure that we've aligned. Finally, another stage, which is not necessarily embedded in the project, but is one of those continuity points or those areas that go beyond getting the standard out of the gate, but I'll raise it, is the fact that the standard, the best validation really in the end is applying it to its practice or its intended purpose. In fact, we started to move to a whole certification design process, a development of that certification standard and certification for CCDF. So we were able to carry this project deeper and start to use the standards for the design of the psychometric instruments for the certification model. I mean, that is an ultimate way to test if your standard is meeting its aims. And so that's an example of how your validation can go deeper, and we have the instruments to measure that. And we started to do some of that as an extension of the actual setting of the standards and the framework itself. This does not happen in every standards project. It depends on whether you've got the opportunities to go beyond with how it's applied. But finally, the one other thing, of course, that happens once it's validated is we come back to that advisory committee. So along the way, they were kept appraised of the activities. They were making decisions. They were monitoring the progress. They were reviewing, the conditions that we were demonstrating of things like the level of representation. They were seeing that we were, checking the boxes and making sure that there were compliant with regulations if we identified them, etc. So at the end, though, we need them to come back to the table, and we need them to sanction that the work met the goals. So they're checking all of that stuff. So bottom line, they need to verify that we met those project objectives, that we got the level of stakeholder engagement as intended, that the due process we followed in our methodology was met. And so there's lots of depth behind those, but we have the onus of walking through all of that, not just at the end, but throughout the project, and ultimately they sign off on it. And that starts on that process of getting, along the way, there's testimonials collected as well, but we finally get that endorsement by this advisory council, which was really the influencers as well. And that enables CCDF to then sanction the standard, to put it out there definitively and forcefully and say, this is an industry standard. It is recognized across the board. It meets these high criteria. It's effectively de facto aligned with things like certain ISO protocols and other things. And of course, this idea of endorsement grows over time when you start to see interests of groups starting to work with standards on how they apply them, how they want to invest in them, they want to license them. There's other models around how this builds beyond the life of this project. Finally, of course, the last section I'm going to flip through rapidly because it's a little less important for today, perhaps. But then when the standard's set, it's not done. This is a dynamic and iterative process. It needs to get out there. There are processes, just functional things like the final edit, the production and broadcast of it that takes on multiple forms. Remember, we're still working with some of those principles like accessibility, for example, and other factors. So it's multiple and adaptive formats, etc., and a strategy that gets it out there. And then, of course, there's the idea that it makes sure that it's implemented and used for different purposes as was intended. So the informational tools around it, perhaps ancillary tools to help people connect with this, becomes part of the work, so that it's used for things like credentials, like the certification program that was built, or maybe a credential even in an institution, or in fact for career guidance, for kind of curiously, the shoemaker shoes here, their own material to help them promote career advancement in their own field of practice, right? So there's a whole bunch of tools that start to get developed in the application and the use of the standard, and you see those examples on the screen, but that, of course, is not the definitive list. And then finally, there's program evaluation we won't get into, but it's your classic stuff of looking at, what would you do differently, blah, 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 and how would we manage it? And then we also worked with CCDF on what happens beyond this. How do you maintain this? What policies and practices are in place? What kind of quality assurance models might you employ so that the standard doesn't get stale, that it's not another 10 years later when you revisit it. It's iterative, it's evolving, it's responsive. And so there's mechanisms and protocols in play to enable that to happen and cascade through those different processes. So there's that's basically the structure around it. There's different instruments to look at how you might set policies around. That's just an illustration of it. So that brings me to the end of what I was presenting. I know it was a little, I think I fit within the time frame we were imagining, but of course there's so much more that could be said on a number of those fronts. And maybe for the benefit of the group, Florian, what I'll do is I'll stop sharing because there's no other slides, although I have other decks. If some questions come up, I can maybe pull up. But I'll stop sharing just so we have a different viewpoint and we can get into more questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Philip. This was really, really interesting. A lot of information to process. I know it's very intense, but we now have really almost 20 minutes time, well, 15 to 20 minutes time to really ask questions, go deeper. Let me start by one question that was raised by Emil before. To both of you, does this new competence building system require a significant change in long-term education?
I can start a response to that. You know, I think what it did for us in Canada was it created more demand for training programs. We have had historically a real patchwork in terms of particularly post-secondary training programs for our field. And often a program would be established, but the demand would not be high enough for the post-secondary institution to see it as financially viable to keep it going. And so we would have a program start and then it wouldn't continue. What we're seeing since the establishment of our new standard is a regeneration of interest in getting training to meet the standard. And so we're seeing more and more programs being established or the existing ones being strengthened. So we're starting to see a trend in the context of this work. We obviously work very closely with post-secondary and private training providers. And so there's been a real interest in mapping their program to the new standard and being very clear about how the curriculum meets the new standard. And so I think it has built a stronger market for training in our field.
Right. Thanks a lot. While our guests please think about questions to our speakers, please put them either in the chat, or if you want, you can also speak out, but in English, please. Otherwise, put it in the chat. Whilst you are thinking about questions, can I ask you one? Because, I mean, you both have full-time jobs, also the ones involved in your standard development process have full-time jobs. How much time in the end did single key stakeholders that you involved really had to invest to be part of that process? Can you quantify that in terms of time?
Can I just say a lot?
Yeah, how did you manage? I mean, that might be challenging for many to invest in that, invest so much time. How did you manage that in practice?
Well, I would say that we were very lucky in the sense that we were able to actually have funding from our federal government to do this work. So we had 3 years of funding. It wasn't. We could argue that it perhaps was not at a high enough level and there wasn't enough time, but it made a huge difference because it did mean that we could devote staff time from our team and we could engage in a contract agreement with Philip's group. So that made a huge difference. The first time that we did it, I would say 80% was voluntary. You know, it was just off the side of our desk and we were determined to do it, so we did it. This time I would say maybe 45% was voluntary, 50% voluntary. It's you know, and the funding was a bit by luck. You know, we had been invited to present to government about something completely different. And as we were talking about the original standards and that they were old, and there was somebody in the audience who wasn't even, you know, the main target of our conversation, who worked in this branch of government that helps all sectors, any sector, with to strengthen. And we had never even thought of going to them for funding. So it was all just really a lot of good luck that we ended up with this funding.
Well,
Okay.
and I'll add to the
Please.
answer. I mean, I thought about it from a slightly different lens. In terms of level of engagement or effort, look, my view of the world on this is that we tried to produce a seductive process. And I would suggest that the more you get people involved, the more they wanted to be involved and own this process. So I think that that engagement message I tried to convey is a really important one to have people think critically about. It's so important that we offered different ways in which people could participate and enable them to engage in some form or another. And then, of course, you have to support that. You have to really be behind it. Otherwise, they'll abandon it and have a lot of skepticism. So I would suggest it's perhaps one of the most important realities of trying to do this work well is to think very carefully about the right supports around that, because it should be a seductive process. And in fact, I can tell you that there were people that near the end of our setting of the standards that were feeling a little like they were losing something, right? Like because those relationships and those efforts were starting to wane, and there was a real community built. Not that it wasn't there before, but there was a real big cause. They were all around. The other thing that I think helped here, I mean, just as me suggesting, and Serena could suggest otherwise, but the other reality was that these standards were really the impetus for moving forward on the certification of the professional credentials as well. So on one hand, they also, everyone understood that there was this other goal too, right? Like the next step was going to be these professional credentials. And I think that created some incentive as well for people, because that was a real interesting item for them. Like that was a real important thing in terms of really bringing to light the what it meant for them personally, individually, in terms of really attesting to their profession as a career, for instead of it being relegated as something that wasn't so critical.
Right.
So, I think that the engagement is not that hard in some respects. It's really about, and by the way, there were limitations with resources, but it didn't limit us from doing things like virtual meetings or telephone calls, which, are a whole lot less costly than trying to convene them.
Sure. Thanks a lot. There is another question coming in from Emil here. Do we catch up in a circular process, definition, on-site research, analysis, etc.? I guess that question is related to the continuous development of the standards.
I'm not sure that I understand the question entirely. Look, I think any good developmental model requires us to be nimble and adjust to emergent demands, especially in this field. I mean, there's a kind of meta thing happening with the career development field, in my view, right? It's responding to these issues in the labor market writ large with all the clients and groups that you serve, of course, but it's also true of its own field of practice. So for an industry standard to be relevant, it has to adapt. Look at the disruption we had during this pandemic and how much it made us reflect on change that's happened in the world of work and workplaces. So I don't see it so much as get to a certain point, wait and revisit. I think that if you look at it differently, it doesn't feel that way. It's more like you're adjusting over time. You're reflecting on adjustments, and so it's more and that's where it succeeds.
And do you have accompanying research regarding the applicability of standards? Emil just added that additional question.
Well, maybe I can. You go ahead, Philip, and then I'll.
Oh, sorry, I don't mean to steal the time. The one thing I would suggest about that, now that there's a standard of this ilk in place, it brings coherence to defining of the field, right? And that spurns on all kinds of activity and research itself. Indeed, I mean, it's not that the research wasn't there before, but now there's a more sticky framework for it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I would just maybe respond from a policy funding perspective. And in our experience, and I'd be interested if this is the experience of those coming from other countries, in Canada, governments are much more interested in funding things that like shiny things that they can look at and be able to hold up and show people. And so our governments are much more likely traditionally to fund, say, the development of the framework than they would be interested in funding all of the work that needs to happen beforehand to be ready to develop a good framework, and all of the work that has to happen afterwards to implement it and get it embedded and do that ongoing research and ongoing review and revision. And so from a policy funding perspective, the challenge is to help policymakers and funders to see the broader process that really needs to be embedded for the actual thing, the shiny thing that they're interested in to be of quality.
That actually brings me to another question. I mean, given your experience that you have now, this recent one with developing the standards, what is your key advice to countries represented here and in general that want to engage into standard development in terms of process, stakeholders to involve, the scope of the standards, etc.?
Well, my short advice would be to get some sleep before you start, because you won't sleep so much once you get started. I'll touch on a couple of things and then I'll pass it to you, Phil. I'm sure you'll have things to say as well. A few things that I would say. One is coming back to context and really knowing your own context. And I mean that in the most comprehensive way possible. So know your own internal context. Where are you in terms of the maturity of your profession? Who in your profession needs to be involved and needs to be engaged? Who are the leaders that need to be bought in, and who is working on the front lines, and how to ensure that all are represented, that their voices are heard and respected. And that includes both lenses of geography, but also lenses of culture and lenses of equity deserving groups. And so really understanding your internal context. And then of course, you have to understand your external context too. What is happening in the labor market? Where are you most needed as a sector? What's the political landscape? What is the funding landscape? To really understand those contexts before you start is critically important. And I spoke to this a little bit at the beginning, but and I think I made a comment in the chat. I don't think I can say strongly enough that the how is as important as the what. It's unless you're prepared to move into this with a curiosity that you don't already know what the outcome will be, unless you're prepared to be absolutely committed to being honest and transparent and inclusive along the way, all of those things matter, because at the end of the day, as Phil said, trust and influence, if you don't have that, the standard will sit on a shelf, and so those relationships really matter.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
Many of the things I included in the presentation, I tried to emphasize some of those areas where I thought were most important, and I'll just maybe add 2 points. One, the governance structure around these things, I think, are very important to think about up front. To build that trust and influence in a way, the premise is that you have the right leading body on it, right? That people can feel comfortable subscribing to their leadership around the work. And I know that can be tricky in some contexts. So if it means even setting up a new structure that you have the right governance that's representative, I think for some might be the real starting point. The other thing I think is important to keep in mind, and I didn't really speak to because of time, is it's not like you're starting with a blank slate anywhere. I mean, these practices, these kinds of, the stakeholders are out there. There are different elements that are already impacting the sector, whether it's policy or what have you. So I think that the sober point here is that the model has to reflect on how you bring all that together, right? Like, it's not about parking all that and throwing out the baby with the bathwater, as they say. It's really, how do you bring harmonization to those practices, collectively, and set your new goals. It's not just starting from scratch. There's lots to build on, and that becomes important to that engagement exercise. I mean, I could go on, but I think others key points were, I hopefully reinforced with some of that message I included earlier.
Thanks a lot, and we're coming to an end, but there is one more question from Fotini from Greece, asking, does the standard lead to official accreditation? And can I just add to that, maybe you can very quickly also respond to, I mean, the standards are applicable across sectors, no? Employment, education, youth, etc. What did that change, so to say, or what impact did that have?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can start. I mean, in our case, we built the standard knowing that we wanted to move to national certification. And so the standard was built with that purpose in mind from the beginning. That does not necessarily have to be the case. I think, as Phil very, very well pointed out in earlier slides, you set your purpose at the beginning, and your purpose may be to create a competency standard for other applications. It may be to set that standard to influence training in your field, or it may be to set the standard to influence practice in your field. In our case, we wanted to do those things, certainly, but we wanted to move all the way to setting a standard that would lead to a national certification. And so, yes, in our case, it has fed into the creation of a national certification program, and which we are still working on. We have not yet launched it. We've tested it, we've pilot tested it, and we are currently refining it. But to launch it required new partners and new resources. So we're still in the process of doing that. But in our case, yes, our goal from the beginning was to move from a scenario where we had this patchwork of different provincial or regional certifications toward one pan-Canadian national cohesive standard and certification.
So to add to that, the certifications that Serena is referring to were all around a professional credential, acknowledging the competence of those practitioners. The truth is that the standards, this framework can inform any other type of credential, whether it's academic or ministry-led and so on. And I'm sure that is starting to happen where there were diplomas or degrees or what have you. The question, though, made me think about something else. I mean, in Canada, we would use the word certification around an industry professional credential, but accreditation is really about whether certain programs like education and training programs also support the standard. Like, in other words, like an obvious example would be if you're a post-secondary educational body or a tertiary body offering programming for to train or educate career practitioners, is the curriculum aligned with these standards? The whole movement towards an accreditation schema that is aligned with these standards, I suggested to Serena and her group, would be invariably the demand once they got the framework out, just like other things would come up. That typically happens. You set these standards, they start to inform practice in many ways, including the credentials we talked about. But then, of course, all the training bodies, the both private and public, and other suppliers and other groups want to be able to demonstrate that they're producing graduates or producing tools that align with those standards. And in that sense, the demand, I'm confident the demand for an accreditation model that aligns with this is probably in the books. If Serena's group was willing and eager to take those steps, there is a need for it. Let's just put it that way. And it is designed to inform that, right? So if there was a movement to design an accreditation schema like that, there's no debate that the framework itself would begin to inform that quite neatly. It was set up with that in mind.
Thanks a lot, Serena and Philip. I don't know how to thank you. It was really great listening to you, and I hope we can stay in touch on that. I'm sure there are many other questions coming up after that event when people watch the recording. So thanks so much for now to you. To all of you, we will take a short comfort break. So we'll meet at 15:29 again. And stay with us. We will have a very interesting panel discussion, hearing also from two more speakers. And take a break now and see you in 5 minutes at 15:29. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
So, hello everybody. Welcome back. I hope you had a good little break. I know that this was quite intense listening to a long presentation, but at the same time, it's a way to share really details. And in that sense, it was a bit of a top-down, classical, traditional information transition approach, but feel free to ask questions if anything is coming up whilst you're listening to the recording you look at the presentation again that was shared. So I'm now very happy to welcome two speakers here with me. With Mr. Marko Bankovic, Assistant Director at the Foundation Tempus and Euroguidance Office Serbia. Hello, welcome, Marko.
Hello.
Hello.
Excuse me, Florian, can you speak a bit closer to the microphone? Because at times we are losing your voice. Sorry. This is for the interpreters to be able to catch your
I'm sorry
speech.
for that. Okay. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes, it's better now. Thank you.
Okay, great. And I'm very, very glad to have Mr. Peter Weber with us also today, professor at the University of Applied Labor Studies from Germany, and also representing the NICE Foundation today. Welcome, Peter.
Yeah, thank you for invitation. Happy to be here.
Great. And again, I'm very sorry that Gerd from Brussels cannot join us today. He lost his voice, so he was not able to speak. And in a short notice, we weren't able to find a replacement from IAVG, but for sure we will have other opportunities to. So Marko, can I start with you? Serbia, as many of us know, has just recently developed standards. And interestingly enough, you have a package developed. So for the outcomes of career guidance, so you defined career management skills framework, you defined standards for career guidance services, and you defined the standards for the competences of career guidance practitioners. Again, across sectors, so education, employment, youth, and others for service professionals. So I was interested in why. What triggered the standard development at the time, and what were the supportive factors, what were the hindering factors? Just to give us an idea, please.
Yeah, sure. Our standards were enacted in 2019, and at the moment we already had like 15 years of projects and initiatives to develop new services, especially in the education sector, but also youth work, for example, and this all was supported a lot by the fact that we had a national guidance strategy from 2010. And all these new services and the fact that they were usually embedded in the structures that were already doing something else, for example, in schools, in education, and performed by practitioners who did not have career guidance as focus during their initial education. So they got professional development, but not initial education in career guidance. And also the fact that many of the initiatives were developed through projects that had different models from abroad, from different countries, meant that we had quite a variety in provision and the quality of provision. So after a decade of focusing on quantity, on getting wider access, the standards were developed for at the time when there was a particular purpose for accreditation in adult education sector, but we used that as an opportunity to develop it not only adult education related standards, but also to develop the cross-sectional standards that can be implemented in all the sectors and can be used by practitioners themselves as a way to self-evaluate, but also by providers, by donors, by accreditation bodies, why not? And why not clients evaluating the services? And as you said, this means that we had 4 areas of standards. One relating to the competencies of guidance practitioners, which of course allows for selection of candidates for some future certification, but also for their self-evaluation, which is really important in this context. But another area is related to the quality of services themselves, and it's really important because providers, as I told you, in some cases this is not their focus. So we really should focus on what makes a guidance services a quality service. And of course, third relates to the program providing the structural framework. But for us, it was really the fourth one that relates to the career management skills, one of the, I would personally say the most important one, because it sets this concept of career management skills as the cornerstone for the whole system. And it also allows for the individuals to use the standards as well. So if I was to sum up, the supporting factors would be the fact that we had a national strategy and that we had numerous services. And also I would add that there were already European guidelines, and there were already some other models of standards that we used actually in the development of our standards, while the hindering factors were, let's say, the fact that there was lack of initial training of practitioners and that we had a variety of services and variety of sectors. So we really had to integrate all these into the working group where we developed the sectors.
So, okay, apologies. I had some troubles with my microphone. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you. I hope everybody else
Now it's
can hear
better.
you as
Yeah,
well.
thank you.
Okay, excellent.
hear.
Thanks to the technical support. Marco, that's really interesting. I mean, first the objective was to really widen the access, and then you focused on the quality. How did you then develop your standards in terms of methodological approach? Who was involved? Who was in the lead bringing all together? And what are the standards now really used for?
Okay, so to develop the standards, I think, and we heard also from the Canadian case, you know, if you want to be cross-sectoral, you have to involve all stakeholders in the development of the standards. And in our case, the working group was coordinated by the Institute for Improvement of Education, and they had been given the mandate by the Ministry of Education at the time. But the working group involved representatives from the Ministries of Youth, of Labor, Public Employment Service, from universities, schools, some other institutes, employers, also NGOs, and we also involved practitioners themselves. And a couple of organizations, including my own, but also Bosch and GIZ, supported in technical terms. But in the beginning, what is important, I think, to stress it was hard maybe to go past the sectoral borders to get understanding of what different sectors want to achieve. But once we managed to get this unified vision, I think we have managed to have a set of standards that can be implemented in all sectors. This also means that they cannot be so detailed maybe in some areas, but they are used to provide the good framework to assess the services, to identify gaps and plan new developments if you are a provider or if you're a donor. But they can be used in the future as in the accreditation process as the foundation of that process. But also for me, it's really important to stress out that they can be used by providers themselves and by practitioners themselves for self-evaluation and to identify the gaps and areas for developments, because these are also, in our case, I think, very important. And it is very important for these standards to serve as basis for the development of training programs for practitioners. So especially in our situation that I explained, with the exception of Public Employment Service, most of other practitioners are usually embedded in other organizations dealing with other focuses, be it education or youth work or whatever.
Right. I will come back to you, Marco, with another question, but I want to ask Peter now to come in. Peter, we know that the NICE Foundation developed standards for the academic training of practitioners. And I wondered to hear from you, how can countries use those standards? Are they universal, or would they need to be adapted to each country context? What's your experience there?
Yeah, so I think one of our aims at that time was to involve already the different country perspectives. So the NICE network and now NICE Foundation is a foundation where over 30 countries have been involved when we developed the standards on an academic perspective. And at the same time, you saw in some European countries development of standards. You had ELGPN and other activities. So this was a complement to this more political activities from a professional side, to think about what kind of standards and what kind of practitioner roles are needed to use them in the different countries to work with them, and how the intention is. We think whether universities, so program responsible persons, researchers, but also practitioners or managers can use the standard in their national context to compare the standards with what they have or what they want to develop. We learned in this process that of course, national contexts are quite different, the needs are different, also the development of the profession is quite diverse in Europe. And so there's a gap between a written standard and the national needs and the national reality, which need to be filled in a kind of process, as Sarina and her colleagues described that very nicely. And as we did, for instance, also in Germany, I see Karen Schober here in the list of people. So we had also then in Germany a parallel activity where we have involved then practitioners and experts in how to develop standards down to earth. I think today it's quite important that we try to maintain the standards for the academy, and also to look further how our, for instance, training programs, study programs have developed since the last 5 or 7 years in accordance to the standards.
Right. A question that comes up a lot when we discuss with countries, and it's interesting, the title of the standard says it's academic training. So would you argue that actually career guidance practitioners should be qualified at a bachelor or master's level?
So, of course, from our perspective, this was a statement of the standards that we need an academic link in the training. So if you review the standards, you find, and I saw it also with Sarina's presentation, you see competencies which are on a level that need a certain knowledge, but also meta competences and reflection that typically is developed by a more academic training. We at the same time, we are realistic. We looked at many trainings in the European context and see different levels, and also we adjusted the standards also to different EQF levels because of the reality in practice, but also because we see practitioners having different roles. And I think this role differentiation in the standards are very helpful, because you have also practitioners who have career guidance role just in a part of their work. And then you have full professionals who do nothing else than career development and career guidance.
Clear, yeah, absolutely. I think that's an interesting element to look at, to all our participants, look at the profiles in the standards from the NICE Foundation. That's really interesting. Peter, a second question. So giving your experience with that development of the NICE Foundation standards, but also your experience in Germany, what would be a couple of key advices that you would give to countries that engage into standard development in terms of methodology, process, stakeholders to involve, scope, etc.?
Yeah, I think stakeholder involvement is key. From all our experience in the NICE network, but also in the national level, to have engagement of practitioners, but also of political stakeholders and expert stakeholders is key and should be done from the beginning. So not developing something on the desk and then go out, but try to start early, involving these people you want to involve also then into implementation, because this is the crucial point. Then the next thing is the clarification, the scope. So for whom and who is responsible for the application later on, who is also controlling and maintaining what you have developed. Also, this is very important. And so one crucial point we also struggled a bit, at least in the German context, was what is the binding moment? So who is the group or the responsible to also realize that the standards are binding for somebody.
Right.
Maybe last sentence. What we found is that you need core standards and standards that develop the minimum where you want to at least start and reach, but then also to define things that are somehow showing the innovative point and look to the future. And I think the NICE standards are a good example for that, that both is involved.
That's a very interesting point you raised at the end, that also both Philip and Serena addressed. So what is actually the main objective? Do we want to set the minimum level?
Yeah.
Or do we want to raise the bar? Yeah, it's a tricky thing, but maybe you can do both, no?
I think in the NICE standards you have both, and the minimum was needed because you have different perspectives on the countries, and already to agree to something which is the core, and we can say with 45 partners, this is something we want to go on further. This is very relevant, but also shows some points where maybe nobody is in the moment, but where we want to be. And here especially was at that time the development of systems, and also to understand career guidance practitioners as people who develop further the system, who are also work for vulnerable groups and also influence policymakers, for instance, to develop the system.
Absolutely. Thank you, Peter. Marco, can I come back to you? There is one point that also comes up in discussions about, when we develop standards and provide advice to countries. So you said you had the Ministry of Education in lead, and then you had other ministries in the working groups. I wondered, in very practical terms, working relationships, did that sort of coordinating, dominating role of one ministry had an impact on the way other ministries were involved? Did that have a negative impact in the sense of one ministry was more dominant? Just to see the different models of how we structure the leadership of such a process.
Sure. I believe that the national context is highly relevant here, because before we started working on the standards, we actually had a strategy, and we had a national coordinating group for the implementation of that strategy that all the ministries, relevant ministries, were a part of.
Right.
So this was not the first time where we cooperated, when the ministries cooperated in that way. And there is the fact that previously Ministry of Youth and Sports had the leadership role in the area of guidance, and there was, let's say, agreed transfer of that leadership role to the Ministry of Education at some point, which was actually the intention some 10 years ago or 12 years ago, to have this. So there, I think, was a good way for cooperation already existed that we could build on. And the fact that the ministry gave that to the Institute for Improvement of Education at the time, which is now actually those jobs, those tasks were moved to the newly founded Agency for Qualifications, which is emerging as the body which will coordinate the implementation of this. I think is a good model and a good way to have somebody taking care of the implementation, but also having in mind that all the new activities that are being done are actually done through cooperation and involvement of stakeholders. And we are having some of new initiatives to update the occupational profile of guidance practitioner, which will involve which will be led by maybe one ministry, but which will also involve the others into the working group.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you, Marco. I have one last question to both of you before we go to participant questions that actually addresses exactly your last point, Marco. I mean, from your experience in your country's work, in the work on international frameworks, in the case of Peter, what's your advice in terms of ensuring continuous update of standards? How do we ensure that they are always relevant and stay up to date?
Yeah, I can maybe start. So I think there's two things. The first thing is you can't change it always. So I think the standards should be in a way that you can live with them for some years. But then you need also new energy and new resources to start over. So for instance, in the moment, what we're aiming to is to look on the digital issues and how they are linked or can be linked to the existing standards. So this is an external influence that shows that clearly 10 years ago, we have not thought so much on digital competences, whether on the labor market nor for the practitioners, and now that there needs an update, and then you have a chance to do that. In NICE, thanks to some activities of colleagues, NICE is now a foundation. We meet every year, have a chance to have an academy together and discuss our work further. In the national context, sometimes this is more difficult because to bring all these actors together, as the colleague showed, as Marco presented, is of course a big work and needs a new energy to start over, as we should do in Germany.
Yeah, and Peter, maybe very quickly, it was in the invitation package as well, but the NICE Foundation and you personally also involved and did some very interesting recent work on social emotional competences.
Yeah.
And you find a good framework. Maybe you want to say a word about that?
Yeah, but this is also a good point. You work on new things, but then they are not integrated in the standards, you know. So there is a publication, I think, on social emotional competences in the project, also on the NICE page I have linked to. And I think this is this is the emergent field. Already, of course, competence of the client, but very much also of the practitioners. And this is something we should focus on very strongly, because it's basic to many other things in career development.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Marco, on the first question on the
Sure, I can say that the standards in our case have, in my opinion, this developmental perspective that aiming to raise the quality of the system itself over some period, of course, not to be updated every year or every 2 or 3 years, but they are related to the level of the quality in the system at that time. And in some 5 or 10 years, this will definitely need an update. But as we have quite, let's say, cross-sectional standards which are not detailed in some areas, there is a lot of room for development of new tools and documents based on these standards that will gradually over time be updated, of course, with new information, and then that can serve as a feedback loop. And once there is a decision to upgrade the standards themselves, you are not completely left with outdated document, but you have a framework and then a set of other documents and tools derived from it, which have been updated through that period of time.
I think you raise a very important point. It needs to be ensured that somebody monitors if an update is then really needed. Yeah.
Sure, and there should be somebody that, as I said, follows the implementation and that can have this, let's say, coordinating role in collecting the data on the implementation itself, but also then in developing new tools or new documents or new standards at some point.
And we know from practice in European Union countries, at least, there are in many countries national career guidance fora in place that have to some extent that kind of role, no? Yeah.
In our country, we do not have it yet in that form. But as I said, there are developments in that area as well, and I think that one part of this is this new agency for qualifications that can take some of those roles definitely.
I'm aware of the time. We're coming to an end. Let me thank you both, Peter and Marco, for sharing your experience, and really thanks a lot for the time you spent to be with us today. I hope we stay in touch and keep on exchanging. So thanks so much to both of you.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So we're coming to an end. I wanted to remind you again of the second poll. Maybe my colleagues could share once more the link in the chat. It's related to an area that I believe is important. We would like to understand from you if there are areas in which you consider a support need. And maybe we can also share the results if there are any at the moment. So please take a second to go there. Great, we have a couple. So we predefined a couple of areas, but if you don't find the area that you would like to seek support in, then just use the chat to add additional elements. But I see the three main areas are defining actually support to defining an approach for the development of standards, then facilitating stakeholder cooperation across sectors, facilitating the standard development process itself, but as well as ensuring the practical uptake and the practitioner uptake and buy-in is as well relevant, and ensuring sustainable and positive effect of standards. So thanks a lot for participating in that poll. It helps us also as ETF deciding where to put resources on and where to offer certain support. So many thanks for that. Keep on responding. Take the last couple of minutes time if you wish. I just wanted to say thanks to all the speakers that were here today. You invested a lot of time and energy. Big thanks to you, and lots of thanks to all the participants. It was a long meeting, I'm aware of that, but we wanted to kick off really from the content point of view. What does it take to develop standards? It's not something that you do at the side. If you want to engage in it, you should be aware what it takes, and that's why we did that meeting. But we also made very clear the added value of standards. So we did 10 reviews of national career development support systems in 2022 in all Western Balkan countries and 4 Eastern European countries, and gathered data. And we know that standards are really not developed. It's very rare. But that means that there is no clear qualification, that services are not always quality assured. And having standards is really the backbone of quality services for conducting monitoring and evaluation. And that provides you again data that provides the necessary evidence to convince them policymakers to invest in career guidance. And I think that's really an important point. So standards can really change things for the profession itself, but also then importantly for the individual who profits from career guidance, for communities, organizations, for whole societies. So I'm happy that we had that meeting today. I want to thank all of you, and let's stay in touch. We will share the recording and the presentation soon. Thank you very much and have a good day.